What if I told you that in 1978, my family, and every family I knew in Beijing, was living on rationed food coupons? Eggs, cooking oil, sugar, meat, cloth, soap, everything was rationed. We lived in a 20 square meter apartment with a shared communal kitchen and bathroom. This was considered luxurious. We cooked on coal burning stoves. Blackouts were so common that we didn't even think of them as unusual. When you walked down Chang'an Avenue, Beijing's version of the Champs-Élysées, you saw 3 hotels, just 3. And the handful of cars on the road were swimming through an endless sea of bicycles. Fast forward to today. That same avenue is lined with luxury boutiques, Gucci, Louis Vuitton, Hermes. China is now the world's largest luxury market. The country that couldn't feed its people 40 years ago now has more billionaires than any nation except the United States. 800 million people, more than double the entire population of the United States, have been lifted out of dire poverty in a single generation. This is the largest reduction in inequality in human history. And it happened in the span of one lifetime. Let me show you how this happened. Because this isn't just a story about economic growth, it's a story about the most dramatic transformation any major nation has undergone in modern times. And it's a story that almost nobody outside China truly understands. When I was born in Beijing in the early 1982s, China was one of the poorest countries on earth. We were only a few years into what would become known as the Reform era. My father's story captures what was happening. During the Cultural Revolution, my parents were sent to work as manual laborers in the rural South. My father might have spent his life in the countryside, working in a slaughterhouse, butchering pigs. But in 1978, everything changed. Deng Xiaoping, China's new supreme leader, reinstated the national university entrance exam that had been abandoned during the Cultural Revolution. My father was among the first students to take it. Years of blighted hopes ended with one acceptance letter. He was catapulted from the remote countryside to a top-tier university in the nation's capital. I was born there, in Beijing, where our tiny private apartment was regarded as an extraordinary luxury. This was the miracle happening across China. Not just economic growth, but the unimaginable transformation taking place for hundreds of millions of Chinese families within a single lifetime. To understand how this happened, you need to understand where China was in 1978. And I mean really understand it, because the starting point makes the transformation even more shocking. By the mid-1970s, China's economy was in shambles. The Great Leap Forward, Mao's campaign from 1958 to 1960 to transform China from an agricultural nation to an industrial powerhouse, had ended in catastrophe. The Great Famine, not the Great Leap Forward. Government policy led to a 15% decline in grain output in 1959 and another 16% decline the following year. During this time, the entire nation suffered from severe famine. Then came the Cultural Revolution, 10 years of political upheaval that devastated what was left of China's economy. By 1976, when Mao died, 80% of China's 800 million people were living below the poverty line. Think about that number. 640 million people in dire poverty. To put it in perspective, that's twice the current population of the United States living in extreme deprivation. China had become a nuclear power in 1964. It had successfully launched a satellite in 1970, becoming only the fifth nation to do so. But these technological achievements couldn't hide the basic fact: China was desperately poor, and its economic system was broken. This is where Deng Xiaoping enters the story. And here's what you need to understand about Deng. He was a pragmatist in an ideologically charged era. When he came to power in 1978, he faced two enormous challenges. The first was economic. How do you fix an economy that's performing far below its potential, where people are starving despite working in the fields all day, where prices make no sense because they're set by government decree rather than supply and demand? The second challenge was ideological. China's leaders had been guided by rigid Marxist-Leninist doctrine. Private property was considered inherently evil. Free markets were capitalist poison. Any deviation from central planning was seen as betraying the revolution. Hardliners in the Communist Party would resist any change that smacked of capitalism. Deng's genius was in how he navigated these challenges. He famously said, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice." This one sentence effectively ended the fevered debate about the superiority of socialism versus capitalism. What mattered was results, not ideology. But Deng also understood something crucial. You can't transform an economy overnight. The Soviet Union and Eastern European countries tried that approach. They applied shock therapy, attempting to address all the inadequacies of central planning in one fell swoop. The result? Economic chaos and social upheaval. Deng took a different approach. He called it crossing the river by groping for the stepping stones. Move gradually, experiment with change. See what works, adjust based on results. This gradualism allowed China to transform without destabilizing the entire system. And so began what would become four major waves of reform, each addressing a specific weakness in China's economic system, each triggering a surge of growth. The first wave began with agriculture. When Deng came to power, 80% of Chinese people lived in the countryside. They worked in people's communes, collective farms, where families toiled together in exchange for tiny, equal shares of whatever they produced. This system provided almost no incentive to work harder or smarter. So, even though most Chinese were working in the fields, agricultural production couldn't feed everyone. Deng's solution was elegant and revolutionary. Introduce a dual system of pricing. Replace collective farming with a household responsibility system. Let farmers work individual plots of land. After turning over a portion of their harvest to the government at state-set prices, farmers could sell the rest at market prices and keep the profit. The results were staggering. Between 1,978 and 1,984, grain yield per unit of land increased by 43%. Real agricultural output increased by more than 50%, despite fewer people working in agriculture as many moved to cities. The number of rural people living in extreme poverty fell by half, from 250 million to 128 million. In just 6 years, I was a child during this period, but I remember what it felt like. By 1985, coupon rationing was effectively over. Those coupons that had controlled every aspect of our consumption became collector's items. By the time I reached middle school in the early 1990s, food was available, not just in abundance, but in dazzling variety: Coca-Cola, Korean cream cakes, potato chips. These were novelties that felt almost magical. When the first McDonald's opened at the corner of Wangfujing Street and Chang'an Avenue in 1992, the queue extended for blocks. My parents used Happy Meals as rewards for good grades. That's how much of a luxury they were. The second wave of reforms came in the mid-1980s, with the creation of special economic zones. These were designated areas where China essentially said, let's see what happens if we give businesses the freedom to operate more like they do in capitalist countries. The privileges were extraordinary: tax exemptions, reduced customs duties, cheaper land, greater flexibility in labor contracts. The first four SEZs were established in Shenzhen, Zhuhai, Shantou, and Xiamen. Foreign firms poured in, bringing technology, equipment, and know-how. They benefited from China's cheap labor, business-friendly environment, sound infrastructure, and huge domestic market. By 1984, the government rolled out similar programs in 14 more cities. China was becoming a global center for processing exports, taking intermediate goods from abroad, assembling them, and shipping out final products. But by the late 1980s, momentum was slowing. The Tiananmen Square events in 1989 ground the economy to a halt. Opponents of reform started gaining ground, arguing that China had gone too far in embracing market mechanisms. This is where Deng made his boldest move. In 1992, at age 87, he embarked on what became known as the Southern Tour. He traveled to the special economic zones in southern China and delivered a series of speeches encouraging local officials to be enterprising, entrepreneurial, to continue opening markets. He pledged unwavering support to private enterprises. The message was clear: reform was not just continuing, it was accelerating. This launched the third wave of reforms, focused on the private sector and state-owned enterprises. Let me tell you a story that captures this moment perfectly. There was a man named Nian Guangzhu, barely literate, who sold roasted melon seeds. His brand? Fool's Melon Seeds. The name was ironic. Nian was anything but a fool. His melon seeds became wildly popular. To keep up with demand, he hired workers. When his workforce reached 12 employees, alarm bells went off. Under Marxist doctrine, hiring wage laborers was considered capitalist exploitation. Nian was arrested multiple times. His business was shuttered, then reopened, then shuttered again. The case eventually reached Deng Xiaoping's desk. In October 1984, Deng made a momentous decision. Fool's Melon Seeds would be allowed to stay in business. The implications were enormous. Private businesses would be allowed to expand. The barrier of 8 employees, beyond which you were considered an exploiter, was effectively removed. Entrepreneurs seized this opportunity. Private enterprises surged. By 1994, only a decade after the term privatization was taboo, the private sector was generating 40% of China's urban employment. Today, it employs around 80% of the urban labor force. Meanwhile, the government turned its attention to reforming state-owned enterprises. For decades, SOEs had been the economic backbone of the nation, but many had become drags on the economy, inefficient and unprofitable, kept alive only by government support. The government granted managers more autonomy. SOEs started incorporating and listing on stock exchanges. Unprofitable companies were allowed to fail or were sold to employees. The fourth wave came in 2001 when China joined the World Trade Organization. This was China's full integration into the global trading system. Foreign capital flooded in, flowing to export companies, the industrial sector, hotels, construction. In 1978, China had ranked 33rd in global trade, with total imports and exports valued at $206 billion. By 2009, less than a decade after joining the WTO, China had become the unequivocal global export leader. By 2017, China's total imports and exports hit $4.1 trillion. Now, here's what's crucial to understand about this transformation. Many people assume that China's growth was driven by massive government investment, the state pumping capital into the economy, building factories and infrastructure. There's some truth to that. China's investment rate has averaged twice that of the US, but research shows that capital investment wasn't the main driver. The real driver was productivity growth. Total factor productivity, the measure of how efficiently labor and capital are used, played an even more significant role than capital accumulation. This is critical because massive investment is unsustainable in the long run. Eventually, you hit diminishing returns. But productivity growth, that can continue indefinitely. What drove this productivity growth? The reforms themselves. Restoring the link between effort and reward, allowing price flexibility, enabling competition, permitting mobility so people could move from farms to factories, opening up to international trade and investment. Each wave of reform unlocked productive capacity that had been suppressed under central planning. Let me put this in perspective with some numbers that will blow your mind. Between 1978 and 2016, life expectancy in China increased by nearly 10 years. Infant mortality dropped by more than 80%. 800 million people were lifted out of dire poverty. This is the largest global reduction in inequality in modern times. GDP growth averaged 10% per year between 1978 and 2011. At that rate, following the rule of 72, an economy doubles every 7 years. China's economy didn't just double, it multiplied many times over. The tangible effects were visible everywhere: new buildings springing up overnight, floods of new tramways, cars, trucks, railway lines, bridges, highways. I lived through this transformation. I remember the scarcity of my childhood, the rationed food, the tiny apartment, the coal stoves, the blackouts. And I remember the abundance that followed. By the time I left for university in America in the late 1990s, Beijing was unrecognizable. The 3 hotels on Chang'an Avenue had become dozens. Sea of bicycles had been replaced by cars. Shopping malls sold goods from around the world. And here's what struck me most when I arrived in New York. I wasn't shocked by America's wealth anymore. China had caught up so fast that the gap no longer felt insurmountable. My American classmates were fascinated by China's transformation. They'd ask, how did it happen so fast? And I'd realize they had no idea what China had been like just 20 years earlier. This is the story that almost nobody outside China truly understands. We're not talking about gradual development over centuries. We're talking about a transformation from desperate poverty to middle-income prosperity in a single generation. From food rationing to the world's largest luxury market. From Mao's gray jacket, which everyone wore because there was nothing else, to Gucci, which millions of Chinese can now afford. But here's what's even more interesting. This transformation didn't happen according to the standard economic playbook. China didn't have secure property rights. It didn't have rule of law in the Western sense. It didn't have an easy business environment or transparent regulations. According to conventional economic theory, China shouldn't have grown this fast, but it did. Why? Because China had something most countries don't: a government with the capacity to mobilize resources on a massive scale, to direct investment towards strategic priorities, to experiment with different approaches, and scale up what worked. The combination of political centralization at the top and economic decentralization at the local level created a system where local officials competed to boost growth in their jurisdictions. But this system, this unique hybrid of state and market, was designed for rapid catch-up growth. And that's what China achieved. The low-hanging fruit has been picked. The easy gains from moving people from farms to factories, from allowing price flexibility, from opening to trade, those gains have been captured. Now, China faces a different challenge: transitioning from catch-up growth to innovation-based growth, from a system designed for rapid expansion to one suited for mature, sustainable development, from quantity to quality, from speed to stability. This is the new playbook that China is still writing. And whether it succeeds will determine not just China's future, but the shape of the global economy for decades to come. Because here's the thing: China's transformation over the past 40 years has been the most dramatic economic success story in human history, but it's also been the most unusual. No other country has grown so fast while deviating so far from the standard prescriptions of Western economics. No other country has lifted so many people out of poverty so quickly while maintaining authoritarian political control. Understanding this transformation matters for everyone, not just because China is now the world's second largest economy, but because China's path challenges many assumptions about what's necessary for economic development. Property rights? China's were murky. Democracy? China didn't have it. Rule of law? Inconsistent at best. And yet, 800 million people escaped poverty. This doesn't mean China's model is superior, or that it should be copied. But it does mean we need to think more carefully about what drives economic growth, what trade-offs different systems involve, and what the future holds for a world where China plays an increasingly central role. In the next episode, we're going to dive into one of the most distinctive features of China's system, the one that drives economic growth at the local level, but also creates some of the biggest challenges China faces today. It's called the mayor economy, and understanding it is key to understanding how China actually works on the ground, in cities and provinces across this vast nation. But it all starts here, with this transformation. From Mao's jacket to Gucci, from food coupons to luxury boutiques, from desperate poverty to middle-income prosperity. In 40 years, one lifetime, this is the China miracle. And now you understand how it happened.